Good day to everyone, and thank you for joining us. India wants to become a developed country by 2047, and it plans to reach its net zero goals by 2070. The NITI Aayog's modeling exercise, which looks at whether these ambitions can be pursued together, is an important document. It helps us understand what kind of energy systems India would require for its ambitions and how this transition can be then financed as well as delivered. But these decisions are also being made at a time of great volatility in energy prices and rapidly rising power demand. At a time when there is considerable uncertainty around trade, technology, and global capital flows because of the ongoing conflict in West Asia, which has hit economies the world over. This study is a landmark for India because it comes at a time which is volatile, but also because it looks as far ahead as 2070. What does it really tell policymakers, states, and companies about the decisions that they need to make now? Joining us is Venugopal Mothkoor, Senior Specialist and Director Development Economics at the NITI Aayog, and member of the core team behind this study. Venu, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Archana. Thank you for having me.
If I can start with the exercise itself, maybe you could walk us first to talk about what this study actually has tried to do, because there have been many studies on energy transition in India. But what is it that the NITI Aayog was trying to understand through this particular modeling exercise, and what was the mandate that you had, and what could a study of this scale tell us that the earlier works did not?
Thank you, Archana. I think the study has come at a very opportune time when the world itself is going through unprecedented energy crisis, especially Asia Pacific being the most impacted. With the crude oil prices at some days probably have doubled in terms of their historical averages. Gas prices have doubled. Many economies, especially in the Asia Pacific, have started aggressive demand reduction measures primarily. India, on the other hand, kind of managed much more tightly in terms of how we kind of navigated through this crisis. But what essentially, when we started this exercise 2 years back, was the objective, as you said clearly, that India has committed to become a developed economy by 2047. That's the vision of Honorable Prime Minister's when he talks about Viksit Bharat. And also in the COP Glasgow, that Honorable Prime Minister has clearly laid down the target of becoming net zero. So when we started this exercise primarily, compared to other modeling exercises where they only looked at net zero or other kind of targets, our goals was clear. We want to first look at becoming a Viksit Bharat economy, and simultaneously then what would it mean for us to pursue the climate targets that we have set forth for ourselves. So simultaneously perceiving these two goals was the objective of the study from the day zero. So that was the core objective through which we kind of looked at the whole of energy transition. And this whole experiment, in that sense, is historic and unprecedented because no other country in the past has kind of did both the transition and the development together. When we look at most of the developed economies, they have either peaked in the past in 90s or 2000s, while India's emissions had yet to peak. It's 2 decades into the future we're looking at India's emissions to probably peak. So we are looking at a transition story where we want to achieve our developmental standards. That would mean a substantial growth in energy needs, a substantial growth in investment needed for pushing for that kind of energy mix, and then also looking at climate targets. So this was the very nature of exercise that we kind of set forth in terms of understanding how this transition unravels. Now, in terms of how we did this, it was not just NITI's efforts, it's a whole of ecosystem or a community kind of led effort where NITI took a lead. NITI has taken a lead in terms of modeling some of the core outputs, but also was joined in equally by some of our knowledge partners, joined by academia, joined by the industry associations. We kind of deliberated with them both in terms of what kind of the technology choices are there for the future, what do these technology choices mean in terms of investment. So a lot of deliberations, a lot of consultations, over 300 plus consultations have been done across 2 years. culminating in the 11 volumes of reports that we've released in February 2026. So that's a brief snapshot of what the process was in terms of what this entire exercise entailed.
Thanks for that overview. And it's interesting that if this is the kind of work that went into it, it's no surprise then that the ultimate figure that we came up with, what it will take to deliver actual growth with net zero, turned out to be a figure like 22.7 trillion in cumulative investments. That's what your report talks about. And that's what a lot of media stories also highlighted. But what we are trying to understand is this financing gap then that comes up that you talk about in your report, about $6.5 trillion. How should we understand this gap and where exactly is this gap concentrated? So, and also if you can talk briefly about the kind of policies then that we would need to be able to meet that gap, whether it's through regulation or whether it's through public finance or, how do you bring in private finance? If you could talk a bit to that.
Yeah, thanks, Archana. I think let me first delve into where does this 22.7 number comes in, and then give you a little bit of an understanding in terms of where does the 6.5 come in from. Now, the big messages that comes in typically from the report are six messages. Let me just highlight from the six messages, and I'll weave in the story of where does this 22.7 number comes in and where that 6.5 number comes in, because you have to probably be better appreciative of this 22.7 number if you try to understand the origin for this 22.7 trillion USD. So first, I think India's energy mix, if you look at India's primary energy mix today, we're 87% fossil and 13% non-fossil. Are we different from other parts of the world? Not so very different. Germany, US, China, in fact, are in a similar nature. So in a sense, our energy mix is not so different from the rest of the parts of the world where they have actually achieved emission peaks, where they have achieved their developmental standards, but their energy mix continues to be fossil driven. The only difference that we see from the developed economies is that our primary energy mix is coal dominant, which is also fossil, while some of the Western economies are gas dominant. So that's the color is the difference between how the energy mix varies between India and the rest of the economies. Now, what is happening? What does it happen in the future going forward, 2050, 2070? What we would need for us to deliver a net zero is that this ratio of fossil and non-fossil probably has to be reversed. So we would want more of our energy mix to be non-fossil in nature so that it doesn't contribute to emissions. So how does we achieve that? How do we achieve that target of moving towards non-fossil? The second important layer to achieve that is to talk about electrification. Now, if we talk about demand electrification in a sense, how much of share is the share of electricity in the total demand sectors? Because in the demand sectors, there's a use of oil, there's a use of coal, there's a use of gas, and there's a use of energy in the form of electricity. So if you look at what is this electrification number today in India, in India's context, it starts at 21%, not so different again from the rest of the economies. Even US is at 21%. There are some economies which are, probably some outliers in that sense are doing much better than Indian economy. Like for example, China, 28%. Norway, north of 40%. There are outliers in that sense, but large section of economies are actually at 20% of electrification. So in some India, not so different. What we say in the report is that this electrification has to go by 3 times at least to deliver on net zero. So we are talking about a significant electrification that is needed. And that significant electrification probably would also mean significant investments needed in case of EVs, in case of heat pumps, in case of electric resistance pumps, electric boilers. So we're talking about the numbers where do this 22.7 trillion comes in. So I'm trying to weave in you the narrative of where does this numbers come in. The third important narrative is that to push this kind of electrification into the economy, what kind of electricity systems that you would see. Today, we have a coal dominant electricity system, but that does contribute to emissions. Our grid emission factor is close to 0.7. So how do we reduce this grid emission factor? So we have to promote non-fossil, right? So our total capacity today, including captive, is around 600 plus gigawatts of capacity. We are among the largest capacities in the world, but we have a 600 plus gigawatt capacity. This capacity probably to meet the 60% electrification needs will probably grow close to 7,000 to 7,500 gigawatts. So we're talking about from a 3-digit number, we're closely moving towards a 5-digit closer to, because we're talking about a 7,500 gigawatts, much closer to 10,000. I'm rounding off in that sense. We're talking about that gigawatts of capacity that needs to come into the ecosystem to deliver on our demand electrification. And this huge capacity is predominantly going to be renewable in nature. Solar, wind, nuclear. Nuclear, you probably have seen the budget announcement of 100 gigawatt for 2047. What we say in the reports that nuclear probably has to scale by even 3 times from the 2047 figure. We're talking about a 300 gigawatts of nuclear. We're talking about 5,000 gigawatts of solar. We're talking about closer to 1,000 gigawatts of wind. So these are the capacities that are needed, and that's where you're typically talking about the 22.7 trillion coming from. So you would need almost a, if you're looking at what is the solar capacity today, 150, 160 gigawatts. But we are talking about a 5,000 plus gigawatts of solar capacity. So capacity increasing by closer to 30 to 35 times. So that's the scale at which we are talking about in terms of electrification. The fourth important solution is primarily where electrification is not a fit primarily. So you would have hard to abate sectors where electricity cannot be a solution, right? So you would probably think about something like green hydrogen. You're thinking about carbon capture. So how do you decarbonize or promote low carbon technologies in those sectors? So we are talking about a green hydrogen of almost closer to 50 million tons that is required for us to become net zero. We're talking about close to 1,000 million tons of carbon capture capacity that is needed. So all these numbers primarily is what is primarily needed for us to move towards that 22.7 trillion figure. So that is where the story of 22.7 trillion comes in. Now, where does this gap come from, right? So what we did interestingly in this report series is that there is a report which talks about financing needs. So we didn't stop at estimating what is the investment requirements for us to deliver both on Viksit Bharat and Net Zero. We also looked at how much is possible within the economy through a set of reforms. I do promote financialization. I do promote corporate bond markets. I do promote some of the patient capital to be getting reallocated towards clean energy sectors. So with a set of reforms that can be enabled within the Indian economy, including attracting foreign capital, I can mobilize closer to 16.2 trillion in the economy. Now, this gap is now a difference of the demand and the supply that can be enabled through a various set of reforms from the supply side. Then is what is the 6.5 trillion. Now, what does this actually translate is that with all set of reforms that are possible, I can only mobilize 16 trillion, which would mean by that 6.5 trillion that remains has to come from outside. If you look at what is the mix today in terms of foreign versus domestic, it is close to 87% is approximately domestic and 13% is approximately is what is foreign money. So this, sorry, I think correction, 83% is domestic and 17% is foreign. So this 17% has to be scaled to 40%, 40 to 42%, because the 6.5 also has to come from external sources. The last important message what we lit, and I'll just stop here, is that if this money comes in from foreign, or this is the scale of investment that is needed, how does it impact the net zero, right? Because people generally were talking about, is the transition towards green, is it net negative for the economy? Are we going to lose jobs? Are we going to lose productivity? So these are some of the nuances that are kind of looked into the macroeconomic aspects of the transition report. That's the second volume. The important message, and I'll stop there, is that what we conclude is that net zero is net positive for the economy, and there are greater jobs created under a net zero transition compared to a BA scenario. So let me just stop there, and these are the important facets that are coming out from the reports.
So you've said something very important, and it's obviously something that is a big part of, should be a big part of how we now plan our next moves. So then between now to 2030, say, what are the concrete steps that need to be taken and are being looked at to be able to then do two things? One is, like you said, and this is a very important aspect of our policy, is that if India says we can do net zero as well as grow, as long as we are able to meet our the investments requirements, what needs to change, what needs to be done between now in the next 5 years so that we are able to meet a big chunk of our goals. And then maybe if you could talk a little bit about where that gap can come from also.
Yeah, thanks, Archana. I think let me take a little more longish time frame instead of 4 years, because we're already in 2026, and let me just probably use 2035 framing, because given that we're talking about very short time space, I'm talking about a lot of initiatives that are happening in Indian context. So I'll take a little longish time frame to talk about what is happening already and what needs to be essentially done more to kind of complement or accelerate on what we are already doing. Now, first, I think one important thing that clearly comes out is that we're adding impressive set of renewables every year. Now, what has to happen is that this renewable capacity, we've kind of added close to 25 gigawatts or north of 25 gigawatts in the last year. But what it needs in by 2035 is that this 25 gigawatts addition every year probably has to scale up 3 times to 75 gigawatts a year. So that's the scale that we're talking about. We're doing 25 gigawatts, impressive, but we need to do much more. We need to do 75 gigawatts. Are there any other parallels in the world? There are enough parallels. China has done closer to 200 gigawatts in a year. So we do not have to look elsewhere. We can deliver some of these goals that we talked about in the reports. So in the next 10 years, we definitely have to increase the pace of renewable addition that is happening in the economy. Now, while renewables, most of us understand, are intermittent in nature, they are variable renewable energy, they need a complementary set of solutions to come in. So we need to talk about the missing piece in the game, which is a small fraction today. The battery energy storage has to scale up considerably. We have tenders coming in at much more attractive rates. The viability gap funding has helped, but much larger than that, the battery prices, thanks to China, have come up considerably down from from what we're looking at 5 years before. So energy storage is an attractive today. We need to scale up. The battery energy storage is a small fraction today, but what we need to scale it up to the close to the factor of probably building 200 gigawatt storage capacity by 2035 in the next 10 years. So that's the scale that we need to match the variable renewables that are coming into the power sector. The third important thing, and I think we've done an impressive set on the electrification, we're doing impressive on the transport side. Our three-wheelers largely are electrified. Two-wheelers, we are pushing aggressively. We have 6% electrification on the two-wheelers today, 2.5% in the car side. And buses have actually picked up thanks to the PM e-drive scheme. We're adding much more transport electrification on the buses side. But what is probably missing is the trucks, and there's a lot of focus on how do we promote electrification on the trucks. So in a whole nutshell, transport does have kind of a considerable initiatives that are happening in the Indian context where we're talking about such electrification happening. But if you look at what is missing, that we have not talked about what is happening on the industrial electrification. So what kind of solutions do exist? How do we kind of scale up industrial electrification? So I think that's the next big lever that we have to crack. And that's where NITI is now trying to work out, carve out, understand what are the techno-economic solutions to promote industrial electrification. Heat pumps, where do the heat pumps get applied? Where do they make a techno-economic case? Do they need viability gap funding, any electricity technology? So how do we promote industrial electrification? Because even within the industry, the electrification rate, the demand electrification rate is only 16%. And we say in the net zero reports that we need to scale it up to 52% for us to deliver on net zero. So industrial electrification has to happen at a much larger scale. Green hydrogen. We've done interesting set of tenders. SECI has, in fact, probably uh, recently awarded tenders close to zero point 0.7 million tons of green ammonia tenders, coming at a very competitive price at close to $600 for green ammonia, where the green hydrogen pricing is probably around $3.3. Uh, Most of the other tenders in the world in the global context are around 1,000 tons, especially in the European economy. So in that sense, we are much more competitive in terms of our tenders. Green hydrogen is important to scale, to start with fertilizers and refineries. And again, the West Asia crisis is important in that context, that once the natural gas prices rise northwards of $15 on MMBTU level, your green hydrogen becomes very attractive for ammonia in fertilizers. Same is the case with refineries. The third important message, and this is where our report primarily talks about, is that what we say in the report is that three-fourths of India is yet to be built. Now, if we have to build, if we can build it in the right fashion, using right materials, low carbon materials, and right form of design, where you can tap into natural ventilation, or I use much more efficient appliances, right? How do I do that? Is the next big work that NITI is primarily working on. How do I promote low carbon materials? How do I promote integrated design in the building primarily? How do I decarbonize sectors like steel, cement, what it primarily entails, is the next big shift that is needed. So let me just stop here. So in a summary, there are a host of things that we're doing, but primarily can be bucketed into solutions like electrification, solutions like green hydrogen and carbon capture, solutions like nuclear, again feeding into the electrification story, scaling up of renewables plus nuclear feeding into the electrification story, green hydrogen, carbon capture feeding into industrial decarbonization. The third bucket is, we're talking about some behavioral solutions or solutions of promoting high energy efficient appliances. So there's an efficiency story. So these are the three big levers to conclude in terms of what should we prioritize in the next 10 years.
That's an excellent overview, and I think some very important points there. So, as I understand, we are looking at decarbonizing our economy, but ensuring that we have a base load, and we likely will look at nuclear for that more than we will look at coal, which in itself is an interesting push away from the policies that we have so far been pursuing. And secondly, is that you're talking about pushing our focus into new sources like hydrogen and ammonia, and ensuring that we're looking at technology solutions. Two questions then that quickly come up, because if this is where our policy is going to be flowing, one is, what should states be doing? And should there be a separate kind of policy when it comes to electrification? Because we have states that have different capacities at the moment, and some states are resource rich, some states are more focused on renewables already. So, is there thinking in terms of how states should work on it, and whether there should be separate policies for separate states and how they should take it forward? And second is, what is our thinking in terms of, because one of the things that you yourself said is the Iran crisis and the focus that it has brought on our supply chain vulnerability and our dependence on others for fossil fuels. How are we going to tackle then, or is there thinking about how our critical mineral supply chains then, which will be required, also need to be secured? So how are we thinking about these two ideas?
Yeah. So I think two different strands of thoughts. So one, primarily talking about what is happening at the state level, and second, given that we're talking about a transition into a renewable dominant or a non-fossil dominant scenarios, how do we manage our critical minerals? So on the first dimension, in that sense, what are we doing at the state level? I think while we understand that the national roadmap is important, and it does play an important role in terms of attracting investments and creating that positive story. What we also understand is that this has to be replicated at the state level. So what NITI is doing under the program called ASSET, Accelerating State Sustainable Energy Transition, what we are trying to do is, this roadmap that is prepared at the national level is to prepare such roadmaps at the state level as well. And NITI is started working with the government of Andhra Pradesh, government of Orissa, and hopefully with government of Uttar Pradesh soon. With Andhra Pradesh, we have in fact done the first round of roadmap, primarily looking at the next 10 years. How does the state demand going to grow? Where does that demand has to be met from, both from the point of view of electricity and some of the non-electricity sources? What kind of transmission capacity is needed? What kind of distribution capacity is needed? What kind of efficient system primarily has to be built in? So these are some of the discussions that we've been having in the context of Andhra Pradesh. We have begun similar such discussions in Orissa. The idea is to replicate some of these experiences that what we are done at a national level, at the state level. So we're building a state transition roadmaps as well. And under the asset program, there's a second objective. We do not stop at creating roadmaps, but also create a bankable pipeline of projects. Now, this motivation came in from once we have a roadmap, once we have a taxonomy in place, most of the investors and then say, where do I invest? I understand this is the roadmap. You're looking at this scale of green hydrogen, this scale of carbon capture. I'm happy to invest. Show me the project. So that's where NITI is saying that we're trying to come up with a dossier or bankable pipeline of projects, and some of where this bankability is low hanging fruit is hinted in the financing needs report. We talk about municipal pumping, we talk about electrification of trucks, especially in selected routes or among the selected players. We're talking about promoting high energy super efficient ACs, air conditioning. So we're picking up some strands of thoughts from the financing needs report and trying to prepare a bankable pipeline of projects. So that's probably a summary of an answer to your first question in terms of what is happening at the state level, and a mix of, and some of this projectization work that happens, it happens both at the state level and also at the national level. Now, in the terms of the second question, in terms of looking at what would happen to the critical minerals. Now, again, we understand this is a very important facet to look into, and that is the reason we brought in a separate volume under the 11 volumes which looks at critical mineral needs. And what the fundamental basis, as you said, was to understand with the growing renewable capacities into the system, what is the demand for the critical minerals and how this demand manifests in the geopolitical context where most of these resources probably are not there within the Indian context, because some of those resources probably are in African economies, some are probably them in Latin American economies, right? So, and also looking at that angle where a lot of this processing capacity is built in China. So we kind of looked into various dimensions of these issues under the critical mineral reports. So first, we kind of estimate what is in the scenarios that we talk about, what is the critical minerals demand, and this demand in a geopolitical situation that prevails today, what does it actually mean? What we also interestingly do is that if this demand, let's say, of 5,000 gigawatts of solar is kind of materialized, you kind of imported the needed silicon or the needed materials, how much of this demand can be met through circularity, right? Your panels probably after 20 to 30 years have to probably dismantle, new panels have to be installed. So looking into the whole concept of the new waste streams that would come in, solar, wind, battery waste. So how much circular economy can play a role in terms of meeting the new demand, right? So your demand need not be completely met through virgin materials, probably it can also be recycled. So these are some of the facets that we looked in terms of the critical minerals context. And this is what we highlight in terms of, I'm not going to go bore you into the numbers, but these are some of the dimensions that we looked into the report. And we kind of also talk about how do we strengthen the whole mission towards looking at strengthening the critical minerals. How do we promote friendshoring? How do we promote what we have done interestingly in the case of oil and gas? We have built an ONGC Videsh Limited, which has a huge balance sheet capacity to acquire overseas assets abroad. Can we do a similar case in the case of Kabil? How do we empower Kabil, which is kind of a similar role in the context of critical minerals? So how do we empower Kabil on the similar lines of OVL to help us acquire those overseas assets and secure those chains for India? How do we build a kind of production linked ecosystem? How do we accelerate domestic discovery through GSI, how do we strengthen geological survey of India. So there are different facets of this whole dimension what we looked at in the report. And in the macro report, I know I would conclude this with one interesting message, is that to our decrease in oil and gas imports, because we're going to move away from oil and gas, and increase obviously the imports of the critical minerals. How do they offset with each other? And what we say is that the critical minerals imports primarily will be very marginal compared to the savings that we see from oil and gas. So let me just stop there and say that there is a case for critical minerals imports, and we do probably see them rise. But in terms of the volume, in terms of the GDP savings, that's very marginal compared to what we see in terms of oil and gas savings.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Renu, because that's very heartening to know, A, that there is a state's plan that we need to look out for and come back to you on. And the fact that critical mineral supply chains are being thought about so thoroughly, and there will be movement on that, and how we're thinking these things through. What I will do is I'll bring you to my last question then, because the big piece of the puzzle still remains the money that needs to come in, and the fact that investments have got to come in then from private sector. So how should companies look at these set of planning documents, and what is it that they should be looking out for in terms of how India is going to be, where they fit into this, and where private investments and private initiative fits into the scheme of things. If you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, thanks, Archana. I think fundamentally one is that this kind of clearly lays out how we are looking at decarbonizing of sectors. So we'll look at primarily, if you look at the sector reports like transport, what are we looking at in the transport sector, not just in terms of promoting electrification, because sectors like aviation probably need sustainable aviation fuel. What is the kind of sustainable aviation fuel we're looking at that is needed for India's decarbonization journey? What is the shipping sector's horizon in terms of low carbon fuels? So it's just not a story of electricity as well, but it is a story of immense opportunities. Why I say that? Because now if you look at most of the per capita consumptions in Indian context, our per capita consumptions are very low base. Our steel consumption is around 100 kgs, while China is around 600 plus. Same is the case with cement. Same is the case with aluminium. Now we see there's going to be a potential exponential growth in many of these sectors. So that's a huge opportunity for many of the companies to looking at India's story. Also important to say that while there is an opportunity to grow, the most important emphasis is on how do we grow? Do we replicate some of the Western practices, or can we do it much more sustainable? And that's where, kind of we're looking at giving that guidance in saying that, for example, in cement sector, we're looking at some of the blended cements plus carbon capture playing a role. In aluminum sector, we see a role of nuclear coming in form of modular nuclear reactors, plus, some efficiency has to happen. In the steel sector, green hydrogen is going to play in a greater role. So there are some of these important elements that are coming out from the reports, which gives guidance to the companies, first to highlight the size of opportunity, second in terms of how the size of opportunity manifests in terms of what kind of technological solutions primarily we're talking about. So that's how we would want the companies to look at these reports in terms of what directions that India's growth story travels. And what clearly, as I said, and I've said this before, is that 3/4 of India is yet to be built. This is the bigger message that is coming out from the report. And if companies who are actually thinking about, urbanization rates today is around 37%. Most of the developed economies have an urbanization rates closer to above 70%. So we would have new cities that are being built in the Indian context. So how do we build these new cities? Huge opportunities. How do we unlock such opportunities in the context of the whole developmental transition and also energy transition is what people or the companies can find out some insights into these reports. And the way we looked at these reports is not as a static version. It's a living document. We call it as a living document. We place this emphasis because we do understand that technologies will change, and it is important to reflect such technological changes into the future into the reports. So we will update these reports every 2 to 3 years to reflect those technological changes and cycles. So that's the intent.
Thank you. Thank you so much for giving us an overview and also giving us an idea of the direction in which India is thinking as well as acting next when it comes to our transition. I will end with my last question before I say thanks to you and let you go. Sorry. If you could come back to the 6.5 trillion gap, and we'll wrap it up, the conversation today with that. So, the steps that you basically talked about that India is thinking about across sectors and the planning documents that you say will be updated every 2 to 3 years. Will we see a plan for how that a concrete plan for how that gap will be filled, as well as are there milestones that we should look out for even for the 22.7 trillion investments that need to come into India's various sectors?
So I think Archana, you're correct in that sense that while the 22.7 figure kind of gives you the size of the investment that is needed to deliver the transition plus Viksit Bharat, there is a sizable gap. Because now what you look at is, if you translate this to understand very simply on an annual financial needs, uh, this 22.7 trillion would actually mean 500 billion every year that is needed. And what is flowing in the energy sector today is close to 130 to 35 billion. So you would need 5 times of what is flowing today for us to kind of deliver. And this size of growth, primarily in terms of needs, is not that it is a linear requirement, right? I've just divided 22.7 by 45 to come at 500, but that 500 would actually translate much higher in the later part of the decades than the next 10 years. So the next 10 years, the size of the requirement probably would be 200 billion every year, gradually increasing as we closely approach towards net zero, because then you would have exhausted all your cheaper options. Then you have to probably leverage much more expensive options like direct air capture and all of that to mitigate or for you to reach the net zero. So that's the kind of size of investment that is needed compared to what is flowing. How can we bridge the gap in terms of the 6.5 trillion? While I would say that, and this we say in the report, is that the share of external finance is considerably low in the current context. It has to scale up. There's a greater role that we envisage for the multilaterals, primarily in the sense of taking that risky capital to flow. We're probably not asking multilaterals to cover the entire 40%, but what we need from multilaterals to be enabled is that for that 40% to be flown into the Indian economy, right? We need some kind of risk absorption that should happen from the multilaterals primarily. For example, if you look at some of the investment that is coming in, for example, in the Canadian pension funds or the sovereign wealth fund that is coming in through the NIF, right? Most of them are coming at a commercial returns. But if you're looking at technologies like green hydrogen, carbon capture, or small modular nuclear reactors, or electrification technologies like heat pumps, you would need blended finance to come, right? And that blended finance, if some part of the risky capital can be absorbed by the multilateral, right, and some of the patient capital then can from the outside can flow in. So that's how we're looking at in terms of uh, attracting more foreign capital to come into the Indian context. We're also deliberating, and this is an option that we looked at in the report, and probably we will soon release a detailed paper on it. Is the need for a dedicated green finance institution, national green finance institution. So hopefully, a study in the coming months, probably, to say how this green finance institution looks like. How does it look like in terms of meeting this gap, delivering on this gap? What is the role we envisage from the government of India? What is the role we envisage from multilateral sovereign funds of the foreign capital to play? So that's something that we will deliberate in terms of how the existing domestic banking ecosystem has to scale, financial ecosystem has to scale, and how complementary role can be played by the external players primarily.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Venu, because you've helped us understand the scale of the challenge, the solutions that are available. It's interesting that we're having this conversation also at a time when bond conversations are going on and there's preparation happening for the COP this year. Uh, and at a time when multilateral systems need to be strengthened even more, given the context globally and what's going on. And the fact that developing countries like India are looking out for their compatriots and their developed nation partners to step in, and also for investors to step in to ensure that uh, the country of this size and the economy of this size can be built in a way that is prosperous for the entire world and the global economy. And this was a very helpful conversation, very hopeful one. Thank you very much for joining us. And we hope to have you again soon for the reports that you have told us you're working on in the coming months. So hope to see you again soon. And thank you for making the time.
Thank you very much, Archana. Pleasure talking to you. And for those who are looking at where do I find these reports, these are available on the NITI Aayog website. Thank you very much. Thank you.